What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite players of all time, and that is Isaiah Thomas. And recently Isaiah was in the news a lot as he signed a 10-day contract with the New Orleans Pelicans, and he's really been looking for work the past year and a half as the Washington Wizards traded him, and then he was released by the LA Clippers, and since then he was out of a job. And if you know anything about Isaiah Thomas, he's one of the rare talents in NBA history, as he is 5'9", and in his prime was a lethal scorer. And I am happy Isaiah finally gets a shot once again, but the past 3.5 years for Isaiah have definitely been rough. He's only played 86 total games, and he's been on 5 different teams. But that right there is not what I want to focus on. I want to focus on Isaiah's greatest year of his career, that is the 2017 season, one of the greatest point guard seasons in recent NBA history. Now, before I get into this video, if you haven't already subscribed, make sure to do so, and if you could like this video, I'd greatly appreciate it. So with that out of the way, let's get into the video. So to start this video out, let's go back to 2017 and give you guys a little bit of background information. At this point, Isaiah had already spent 1.5 years in Boston, and this was his second full year with the Celtics. He had already played on the Sacramento Kings as well as the Phoenix Suns. But this year in 2017, the offense was totally built around him and his overall skill set, being a dynamic scorer from outside, as well as driving the paint and finishing at the rim. And this Celtics team, much like Isaiah, was an underdog team. You had Marcus Smart, Al Horford, Avery Bradley, Jay Crowder, Kelly Olynyk, and even a young Jaylen Brown and Terry Rozier. A really good mix of young players as well as experienced veterans. And this Boston team would have the best record in the Eastern Conference, winning 53 games. That was the first 50-win season for the Celtics since 2011. And Isaiah this year averaged 28.9 points per game, 5.9 assists, 2.7 boards on 46, 37, and 90 splits. And he finished 5th in MVP voting, the highest MVP finish for a Celtic since Kevin Garnett in 2008. And obviously the most impressive thing about Isaiah Thomas is his great scoring ability, and being 5'9" and nearly averaging 29 points per game. And actually in NBA history, this is the highest points per game average for a player under 6 feet tall, and is the 3rd highest points per game average for a player in Celtics history, and the 5th most total points for a Celtic in a single season. Also, Isaiah this year was top 5 points per game, 3-pointers made, free throws made, and free throw percentage. And the one thing that really stood out to me is how lethal Isaiah Thomas was at the free throw line. And if you look at NBA history of players who averaged 28 points per game and over 90% shooting from the free throw line in a single year, you have an elite list of Hall of Fame players. You have Larry Bird, Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, Rick Barry, and of course Isaiah. I mean, that is an elite list when looking at players who are great scorers and great free throw shooters. And like I said before, this Celtics team was built around Isaiah on the offensive end, and he had a heavy burden every single night to go out there and score big time numbers. And if you look at his scoring breakdown this year, he had 1 50-point game, 4 40-point games, 26 30-point games, and 40 20-point games. And he only scored under 15 points 1 time during this year. So virtually every single night Isaiah had to get at least 25 to 30 points per game for Boston to even have a chance to win the game. That is an extremely heavy burden for any NBA player, but specifically for a player who's only 5'9". And if you go back in NBA history and look at the players who led their team in scoring for the most consecutive games, you once again have a very, very special list. That being Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, and Isaiah Thomas. All 3 of those guys had a heavy offensive burden, and they led their team in scoring for 30-plus straight games. And talking about one of the underrated aspects of Isaiah Thomas, not looking at just his scoring ability, but looking at how he could get in the paint and he could dominate in the pick and roll. If you go back and watch these games, I think Isaiah's height actually kind of helped him when navigating big man. Look at how he finishes around the rim. He uses the basket as a kind of a shield, and he was really great using his body, finishing through contact and finishing around big men. And I think the overall array of shot making Isaiah had was a really rare skill. He could hit floaters, he could hit the bank shots, he was actually a pretty good mid-range shooter, and of course he could shoot the 3, and he was great at the line. So combine all that into one player, and I think you have a deadly offensive force, even at the slight 5'9" frame. Now, one thing that is widely documented is how great Isaiah was at 4th quarter scoring, and actually this year he got the nickname the King of the 4th, and for very good reason. When looking at Isaiah's 4th quarter scoring this year, he had 29 games of scoring 10 or more points in the 4th, 13 games of scoring 15 or more points, and 4 games of scoring 20 or more points. And on your right, you can see how that ranked in the NBA, He was 5th in 10-point fourth quarters, 2nd in 15-point fourth quarters, and 1st in 20-point fourth quarters. I mean, this guy was built for the big moments, and he did not shy away from shooting the game-winning shots. And if you look at Isaiah's highest scoring fourth quarters, he had 29 points, 24 points, 22 points, and 20 points. All those games being top 13 in the NBA, and he had the most 20-point fourth quarters in a single year in NBA history. And the last thing to cap off how great Isaiah was in the fourth quarter, look at the most points scored in a fourth quarter in NBA history. You have Kobe at number 1, Russell Westbrook at number 2, and Isaiah Thomas at number 3, with LeBron James at number 4. Those three other players are first ballot Hall of Famers, and Isaiah is right there with them when it comes to fourth quarter scoring. Now, like I said earlier in this video, this Isaiah Thomas Celtics team won 53 games and had the best record in the Eastern Conference. And when it came to the playoffs in the first round, they would play a very experienced Bulls team that had won 41 games, that had Dwayne Wade, Rajon Rondo, as well as Jimmy Butler. But the very sad and very unfortunate part of this video is that a few hours before this game, Isaiah Thomas would get the news that his sister, China Thomas, had passed away in a single car crash incident just outside of Washington. And this was a devastating blow to Isaiah, as well as the whole city of Boston, as at this point Isaiah was the underdog figure in the heart of the Celtics team. And it was a very heartfelt game and a very emotional game, and despite all that tragedy, Isaiah was still a very decent game, having 33 points on 55% shooting. Now, getting back to on the court, Boston would lose their first 2 games at home and head back to Chicago down 0-2. But lucky for Celtics fans, over the next 4 games, Boston would win 3 of those 4 games by double digits, and outside of game 4, it really was not a close or competitive series. And in total this series, Isaiah averaged 23 points per game, 5.7 assists, 4.3 boards on 43, 20, and 81 splits. Now in the second round, the Celtics would match up against the 49-win Wizards, who were led by the duo of John Wall and Bradley Beal. Now, just like in Game 1 versus the Bulls, Isaiah would have 33 points in this game, but this time the Celtics would actually win that game and go up 1-0. Now, looking ahead to Game 2, this right here was the greatest game of Isaiah Thomas' career, as in this game Isaiah would have 53 points, 4 assists, 4 boards on 54, 41, and 92 splits. And in the fourth quarter and overtime, he would combine for a miraculous 29 points, nearly outscoring the whole Washington team, who only had 30 points during that time. And actually in that overtime period, Isaiah would outscore the entire Wizards team 9-5. Now, all of that right there was great, but what adds to this game being so special, that this game was being played on the same day of China Thomas' birthday, his late sister, who had passed away earlier in the playoffs. And once again, it was a very, very emotional game, as well as a very emotional series. And if you want to look at this from a historical perspective, this game for Isaiah was the second most points by a Celtic in playoff history. It was the most points a player had in a playoff game since Allen Iverson in 2003, and it was the most points in a playoff game ever for a player under 6 foot. Now, getting back to this series, Washington would come out of that 0-2 hole and win the next 2 games, tying it up at 2-2. And in games 5 and 6, both these teams would split, setting up a deciding Game 7 in Boston. And in this Game 7, Isaiah would definitely show out, having 29 points, but the unsung hero of this game was Kelly Olynyk, who had 26 points. And Boston would win this Game 7 by 10 points. And if you look at the stats for the series, Isaiah averaged 27.4 points a game, 7.1 assists, 2.4 boards on 44, 46, and 84 splits, and he outplayed fellow All-Star John Wall and had the greatest playoff series of his career. Now, after riding high versus the Wizards, all that would come crashing down in the Eastern Conference Finals versus the Cleveland Cavaliers, the reigning NBA champions. And Boston by no means was the favorite. They were actually the heavy underdog, and it didn't help when in Game 2, Isaiah Thomas went out with a hip injury. And that hip injury had been lingering the whole year, as earlier in the year, he had hurt it versus the Timberwolves, but instead of getting surgery, he opted to play through the pain and just kind of rehab on the fly. And hopefully that rehab would sustain him for the rest of the year, as well as the playoffs. Now, unfortunately for Isaiah, that would not be the case. Then Game 6 versus Washington, his hip injury would flare up, and then Game 2, Isaiah would be out indefinitely after injuring his hip against Kevin Love. And that Game 2 versus Cleveland in Boston would be the last game Isaiah Thomas would ever play in a Celtics uniform. So definitely not the Hollywood ending you would like for a great year from Isaiah, but all in all, this 2017 campaign was a great year for Isaiah and a great year for NBA fans who were along for the ride. And if you look at Isaiah Thomas, just stepping back from basketball and looking at him as a person, being 5'9", playing in a sport of giants, that provides tremendous inspiration not only to basketball fans, but to any person in daily life. We've seen small guys in NBA history like Spud Webb, as well as Muggsy Bogues, even to a lesser degree Allen Iverson, but Isaiah Thomas was the first really small guy who had a great year, averaging nearly 29 points per game. And I'll make a very bold claim. I don't think we'll ever see a player who's 5'9" or shorter have a year like Isaiah Thomas had in 2017. It's so hard to even make the NBA, but let alone being 5'9" and having an MVP caliber season, those things simply do not happen. And I think Isaiah Thomas' 2017 season will live on in NBA history as one of the most inspirational years from a player ever. So to wrap this video up, yes, I do think Isaiah Thomas in 2017 was at the peak of his powers. I don't think he'll quite ever get there again, but I think it is great. He's finally getting a fair shot with the Pelicans, and I do hope he gets signed to a long-term deal. So as always, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys next time.